Hey guys, tonight we're uncovering a story that's been buried for 90 years. The tale of a man whose name should echo through American history, yet has been erased from every page his famous family wrote. While millions know the story of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her husband Almanzo's dramatic survival on the Dakota frontier, nobody speaks of Almanzo's youngest brother. The boy who watched his siblings chase the horizon. The man who built an empire while everyone else was busy becoming legends. His name was Perley Day Wilder, and this is the story they never wanted you to hear. The morning breaks cold over Burke, New York on June 13, 1869. Inside a sturdy farmhouse just south of the Canadian border, 56-year-old James Mason Wilder paces the wooden floor. His boots create a rhythm against the planks, steady, measured, the sound of a man who has weathered many storms. Upstairs, his wife Angelina, 48 years old, brings their sixth child into the world. The baby's cry cuts through the June morning air. It is strong, healthy, unexpected. They name him Perley Day Wilder. This child arrives at a crossroads in American history. 4 years have passed since the Civil War's end. The nation stretches westward like a man reaching for something he cannot quite grasp. Railroads push through territories where buffalo still roam in numbers that darken the earth. The Homestead Act promises land, free land, to anyone brave enough or desperate enough to claim it. But James Wilder is neither desperate nor particularly brave. He is something more dangerous. He is calculated. The Wilder farm in Burke represents 3 generations of careful accumulation. The soil is good. The barns are sound. The family name carries weight in Franklin County. James could have remained here, could have divided this prosperity among his 6 children and watched them farm the same fields he inherited. Many men would have. James Wilder is not many men. He looks at his newborn son and sees the future shifting. 5 children have already been raised: Laura Ann, Royal, Eliza Jane, Alice, and Almanzo. They have known the New York farm, have grown strong on its reliable harvests, but Perley will know something different. Within a year of Perley's birth, James makes his move. He has been corresponding with his brother-in-law George Day, who settled in Spring Valley, Minnesota. The letters speak of opportunity, of land that can be purchased for prices that make New York seem like highway robbery. The Minnesota River Valley offers rich soil, virgin timber, and something James values above all else, the chance to multiply his investment. In 1870, when Perley is barely a year old, James sells the Burke property. The family, James, Angelina, and their 6 children, board a train heading west. They carry everything they own: furniture, farm equipment, savings that represent 3 generations of Wilder prosperity. They are not fleeing poverty. They are chasing abundance. The journey takes them across New York State, around the Great Lakes, into territories where the war between settlers and the Sioux people has only recently ended. With the natives' forced removal, they pass through lands where the grass still shows the dark stains of that conflict. The train rocks and sways. Young Perley, held in his mother's arms, knows nothing of the violence that purchased his future. Spring Valley, Minnesota, appears on the horizon in late summer. The town is barely 20 years old, carved from the big woods where the Dakota people once hunted. Norwegian immigrants have flooded in, drawn by the same promises that brought the Wilders. The Yankees, English heritage families like the Wilders, represent a minority now, but they hold the economic power. James purchases 90 acres adjoining George Day's property. The price, $500. In New York, such land would have cost 5 times that amount. James counts his money and smiles. He has positioned his family at the edge of America's next great expansion. The railroads are coming. The wheat markets are booming. The land will triple in value within a decade. Perley Day Wilder takes his first steps on Minnesota soil. He will not remember New York. He will not recall the journey west. His earliest memories will be of this place, the big woods gradually falling to the axe, Norwegian neighbours speaking a language he does not understand, the sound of his father's voice explaining that land is not just dirt. It is investment. It is future. It is everything. In the farmhouse that first winter, Angelina rocks her youngest son and watches the snow pile against the windows. She is 49 years old, far from her birthplace, surrounded by children who will scatter, like seeds on the wind. She does not know that the baby in her arms will outlive them all. She does not know that his story will be deliberately forgotten, buried beneath the weight of more dramatic narratives. She only knows that he is here, he is healthy, and the future his father has purchased for him stretches out like the Minnesota Prairie, vast, uncertain, and full of both promise and peril. The American frontier mythology celebrates those who struck out for the unknown. But what of those who arrived as infants? What of those whose destinies were chosen before they could speak? Perley Day Wilder never chose the frontier. The frontier chose him. The Spring Valley of Perley's childhood is a world in transformation. Each season brings new Norwegian families, their wagons loaded with the peculiar mixture of hope and exhaustion that marks all immigrant journeys. They speak a language that sounds like rocks tumbling in a stream. Their customs are foreign, their Lutheran faith more austere than the Wilders' Methodist traditions. But they have money, they buy land, they need supplies. James Wilder watches this influx with the keen eye of a man who understands markets. He plants wheat because wheat is what the mills want, what the railroads will carry, what the international markets will purchase. The family farm becomes a commercial operation. There is no romance in James's relationship with the soil, only profit margins and calculated risk. Perley grows up in this atmosphere of Yankee commercialism surrounded by Norwegian communalism. The contrast shapes him into ways that will matter decades later, though no one realizes it yet. At 5 years old, Perley learns his letters in the Spring Valley School. The one-room building houses children from 6 to 16, all learning together. The teacher, Miss Henderson, is a stern woman from Massachusetts who maintains order with a ruler that has cracked more than one set of knuckles. Perley learns quickly to keep his attention focused and his answers correct. The schoolyard is divided by invisible lines. Yankees on one side, Norwegians on the other. The division is not hostile, merely factual, the way water and oil separate without malice. Perley learns the names of the Norwegian boys, Ole, Lars, Henrik, but does not play with them. His mother has explained that the Wilders are quality people, which young Perley understands to mean they are better, though he cannot quite explain why. At home, he is the baby, the youngest, the one who receives the hand-me-downs and the leftover attention. His oldest sister, Laura, is 26 when he turns 6, old enough to be his mother. Royal is 23, already thinking of his own future. Eliza Jane, 20, is sharp-tongued and ambitious, studying to become a teacher. Alice is 17, quiet and gentle. Almanzo at 13 is the brother closest in age, but even that gap is vast in childhood years. Almanzo pays little attention to the baby brother trailing behind him. He has chores, responsibilities, the weight of being the second son. Royal will inherit the farm. That is the eldest son's right. Almanzo must make his own way and he knows it. He learns farming with the intensity of a boy who understands his future, depends on mastering every skill. Perley watches. He watches Almanzo break horses, plant wheat, repair equipment. He watches his father calculate grain prices and negotiate with buyers. He watches Norwegian families arrive with nothing and, through brutal work, carve farms from the timber. He watches, and he learns that the world rewards certain kinds of men. Those who work hard, yes, but more importantly, those who work smart. In 1876, when Perley is 7, the family commits $50 to the building of the Methodist Church. It is one of the largest pledges, a public declaration of the Wilders' prosperity and standing. The church rises on Main Street, white-clappered with a modest steeple. Every Sunday, the Wilders occupy the third pew from the front, not the first pew, which would be presumptuous, but close enough to matter. Perley sits between his mother and Alice, his feet dangling above the floor. The minister, Reverend Caldwell, preaches about stewardship, about using God's gifts wisely. Young Perley understands that the $50 his father donated is itself a kind of sermon, one that everyone in Spring Valley can read. The message is clear. The Wilders are substantial people. That winter brings blizzards that bury the town in snow that reaches the eaves of houses. School closes for 3 weeks. The family lives in a cocoon of firelight and rationed supplies. Perley learns to entertain himself with carved wooden animals and stories read aloud by Alice. He learns that winter on the Minnesota Prairie is not an inconvenience but a siege, and survival requires preparation. When spring finally breaks, the town emerges to discover that 2 Norwegian families on the outskirts did not survive. They froze in their inadequate cabins, their bodies discovered when neighbours finally managed to reach them through the melting drifts. The funerals are quiet affairs. The minister speaks of God's will. The surviving families go back to breaking ground, planting crops, building the lives that the dead can no longer claim. Perley is 8 years old when he fully understands that the frontier kills people, not dramatically, not in the ways the dime novels suggest, with Indian attacks and gunfights, but through cold mathematics. Those with inadequate shelter, insufficient supplies, poor planning, they die. Those with resources, foresight and capital, they survive. The Wilders have resources. This knowledge settles into Perley's bones like the cold itself. He will never be reckless. He will never gamble everything on the romantic dream of frontier adventure. He has seen what happens to those who do by the time Perley turns 9, his world has established its patterns. The farm prospers, the Norwegian population grows. Spring Valley transforms from frontier settlement to established town. The railroad is coming, everyone knows it, talks about it, plans for it. When it arrives, land values will soar. James Wilder's calculated risk is paying off, and Perley Day Wilder, the youngest son, watches and learns. 1879 marks the year of departure. Royal, at 32, makes plans to claim a homestead in Dakota Territory. Almanzo, at 22, decides to join him. The brothers have heard stories of land so cheap it might as well be free, of opportunities for young men willing to endure hardship for future prosperity. James gives his blessing. He also gives Almanzo 2 things: a pair of matched Morgan horses named Skip and Barnum, and advice about when to sell wheat for maximum profit. Perley is 10 years old when his brothers leave. He stands in the yard, watching them load the wagon with supplies, equipment and ambitions. Royal is confident, his movements decisive. Almanzo is quieter but no less determined. They speak of building a future, of claiming land under the Homestead Act, of becoming landowners through nothing but labour and patience. The goodbye is not dramatic. Frontier families understand that children scatter. The surprise would be if they all stayed. As the wagon disappears toward the Dakota border, Perley feels something shift in his position within the family. He is no longer the youngest child lost in a crowd of siblings. With Royal and Almanzo gone, with Laura Ann married and moved to Louisiana, with Eliza Jane pursuing her teaching career, Perley becomes the child who remains. His father needs help on the farm. At 10, Perley is old enough to handle real work, feeding livestock, hauling water, assisting with the endless maintenance that farming requires. He grows strong doing these tasks, his arms developing the ropey muscle of agricultural labour, his hands hardening into tools. But he also continues school. James Wilder believes in education, at least enough education to manage accounts and contracts. Perley learns arithmetic that matters, calculating yield per acre, determining fair prices, understanding interest rates. He learns reading and writing sufficient to handle correspondence and agreements. He will never be a scholar, but he will never be cheated in a business deal either. The letters from Dakota arrive throughout that year and the next. Royal writes about the homestead claim, about the house he is building, about the challenges and opportunities. Almanzo writes about working alongside Royal, about the land that stretches flat to every horizon, about winters that make Minnesota seem mild. In the winter of 1880 to 1881, the letters stop. The news reaches Spring Valley in fragments, carried by other settlers returning east, by newspapers that arrive weeks late, by the telegraph that finally connected the region to the wider world. Dakota Territory is experiencing the worst winter in recorded history. Blizzard after blizzard. Towns cut off, food supplies dwindling, people dying. Angelina Wilder reads the reports with the tight-lipped silence of a mother who has sent sons into danger. James maintains that Royal and Almanzo are capable men, that they will survive. But the confidence sounds hollow even to Perley's young ears. The winter finally breaks in late April. The letters resume. Royal and Almanzo survived, though the accounts they provide speak of privation that borders on desperation. Almanzo mentioned something about a wheat run through a blizzard, about nearly dying, about a girl named Laura Ingalls whose family was also starving. He does not provide details, and his handwriting seems shakier than before. Perley, now 12, processes this information with the pragmatism he has learned from his father. His brothers gambled on Dakota. They survived, but barely. Meanwhile, Spring Valley prospered through that same winter. The railroad arrived in 1880, exactly as predicted. Land values tripled. Those who held property, like James Wilder, became substantially wealthier, without enduring any dramatic suffering. The lesson seems clear. There are multiple ways to succeed on the frontier. The dangerous way involves homesteading in Dakota Territory. The smart way involves buying property in established towns and waiting for infrastructure to increase values. Perley will remember this lesson for the rest of his life. Over the next few years, more news arrives from Dakota. Almanzo has married that Laura Ingalls girl. They are trying to establish a farm. The harvests are failing. Almanzo contracted diphtheria and has been permanently weakened. Their house burned down. They lost everything. In 1891, Almanzo and Laura return to Spring Valley. They move in with James and Angelina, defeated, broken, seeking refuge. Perley is 22 years old when he comes face to face with his brother's failure. Almanzo, once strong and confident, now walks with a slight limp, his health permanently compromised. Laura is thin and exhausted. Their daughter Rose quiet and watchful. They speak little about what they endured, but their presence tells the story more effectively than words. The frontier had broken them. Perley watches his brother attempt to recover, watches Laura struggle with the humiliation of returning to her in-laws' home as a failure. He makes a decision that will define his entire life. When he leaves Minnesota, it will not be to homestead. It will not be to gamble everything on free land and romantic dreams. It will be to pursue opportunity with capital behind him, with a plan, with the kind of calculation his father taught him. The frontier mythology celebrates the dramatic risk-takers, but Perley Day Wilder has seen where that mythology leads. He will choose a different path. The year is 1895, and Perley Day Wilder stands at a crossroads that will define everything that follows. He is 26 years old, unmarried, living in his parents' Spring Valley home, while his broken brother and sister-in-law occupy the spare room. The house feels crowded with failure and diminished dreams, but Perley has something his brother never possessed: patience and a plan. The letters from Louisiana have been arriving for 3 years now. His eldest sister, Laura Ann, married a man named Baldwin and relocated to the southwestern corner of Louisiana, to a region that newspapers are calling the rice capital of America. Her letters paint pictures that seem almost fantastical to Minnesota sensibilities. Year-round growing seasons, rice fields that produce yields worth more per acre than wheat ever dreamed of being, towns springing up overnight around railroad depots and rice mills. Most intriguing to Perley are the details about opportunity for merchants. Laura Ann writes that the rice farmers, many of them recent arrivals from Iowa and Minnesota, need everything: seed, equipment, dry goods, credit. The general stores in these new towns function as informal banks, social centers, and economic anchors. A man with modest capital and good business sense could establish himself quickly. Perley has been saving. While helping his father manage the Spring Valley farm, he has worked occasional jobs, helping with harvests on neighboring farms, doing carpentry work, handling accounts for Norwegian immigrants who struggle with English. Every dollar earned has been carefully preserved. By early 1895, he has accumulated enough to make his move. The decision comes in March, when Minnesota is still locked in winter's grip and Louisiana is already planting spring crops. Perley sits with his father in the farm office, a small room off the kitchen, where James keeps his ledgers and conducts business. The conversation is brief, practical, unsentimentally economic. The Rice Belt, Perley says. James Wilder is 82 years old now, his movements slower, but his mind still sharp as a merchant's scale. He listens as Perley explains the plan: travel to Louisiana, assess the opportunities Laura Ann has described, establish a general store if the conditions warrant it. James asks, and there is something that might be approval in his tone. "No, sir," Perley replies. James nods slowly. He has seen what homesteading cost Almanzo: health, prosperity, dignity. He has also seen what careful commercial investment brought to Spring Valley. The railroad arrived, land values soared, and those who owned property in town centers became wealthy without ever breaking a sweat over a plow. "You'll need capital," James says. "I have $500 saved," Perley tells him. James considers this. $500 is substantial, enough to purchase initial inventory for a store, to secure premises, to survive the establishment period. It represents years of careful saving, the kind of financial discipline that James himself practiced throughout his life. "I'll match it," James says finally. $1,000 total. This is not generosity. It is investment. James Wilder is putting money into his youngest son the same way he once invested in Minnesota land. He expects returns. Perley extends his hand. They shake. The bargain is sealed. The departure is planned for late April, after the Minnesota planting is complete and before the Louisiana summer heat becomes unbearable. Angelina, now 74, packs her youngest son's belongings with the same efficient care she has applied to every task throughout her long life. She does not cry or make dramatic pronouncements. Frontier women learn early that holding too tightly to children is like trying to grip water. Write every month, is all she says. Almanzo offers quiet advice about travelling light and watching for thieves on the railroads. Laura, his wife, says nothing, but Perley catches her watching him with an expression that might be envy. She sees a young man leaving on his own terms, with capital and planning, rather than fleeing in desperation as she and Almanzo once did. On April 23rd, 1895, Perley. Day Wilder boards the train in Spring Valley. He carries 2 bags, one with clothing and personal items, one with the $1,000 in a mix of banknotes and gold coins. He also carries something less tangible but more valuable, the accumulated lessons of 26 years watching how America's frontier actually works. The romantic version involves brave homesteaders battling the elements. The real version involves capital, infrastructure, timing, and cold calculation. As the train pulls away from Spring Valley, Perley does not look back at the town that raised him. He looks forward, toward the southern horizon, toward a place where winter never comes and rice grows in fields that look like mirrors reflecting the sky. He is not fleeing, he is not gambling, he is executing a business plan. The American frontier mythology celebrates men like his brother Almanzo, the brave homesteader facing down blizzards, but history, Perley understands, is actually made by men like himself, the merchants who arrive after the initial settling, who build the economic structures that transform frontier into civilization, who profit from infrastructure rather than heroism. The train carries him south, through Iowa, through Missouri, through to Arkansas. The landscape transforms outside his window. The grass grows taller, the air grows heavier. Spring arrives early of year the farther south he travels, until he crosses into Louisiana and discovers a place where spring never really ended. This is where Perley Day Wilder will build his empire, not through dramatic survival, through careful commerce. The train arrives in Crowley, Louisiana on a May morning that feels like stepping into a warm, wet blanket. The air itself seems to have weight, thick with humidity that makes breathing feel like drinking. Perley steps onto the platform and immediately understands that everything he knows about climate is about to be rewritten. Crowley in 1895 is barely a decade old, but it vibrates with the manic energy of a town that knows it is sitting on top of a gold mine, or in this case, a rice mine. The main street is unpaved, a red mud thoroughfare lined with buildings so new that some still smell of fresh-cut lumber. Rice mills dominate the skyline, their mechanical sounds creating a constant industrial heartbeat. Laura Ann and her husband meet Perley at the station. His sister is 41 now, weathered by southern sun but prosperous looking. Her husband operates a feed business, another example of smart frontier economics. You do not grow the crops, you sell to those who do. You pick the right time, Laura Ann tells him as they navigate the muddy street in her husband's wagon. The rice boom is just beginning. Over the next 3 days, Perley conducts reconnaissance. He's not impulsive, not the kind of man who makes decisions based on first impressions. He walks every street in Crowley, notes which businesses are thriving and which are struggling. He talks to rice farmers about their needs, to merchants about their profit margins, to railroad men about expansion plans. What he discovers is both opportunity and saturation. Crowley already has established general stores, and competition is fierce, but 30 miles west, there is a smaller settlement called Kinder, named after a man who first homesteaded the area. Kinder sits along the railroad line that runs from Lake Charles to the Texas border. It is smaller than Crowley, less developed, but positioned perfectly for growth. Perley takes the short train ride to Kinder. What he finds is a town that is barely a town at all. Perhaps 200 residents, scattered farms, a railroad depot, and very little commercial infrastructure. The existing general store is a ramshackle operation run by an elderly man who clearly lacks the energy to capitalize on the region's growth. This is the opportunity. Perley returns to Crowley and spends the next week learning everything he can about the rice industry. What he discovers is a revolution in American agriculture. Rice cultivation in Louisiana represents something unprecedented in Southern history. Unlike cotton, which relied on enslaved labor before the war and exploitative sharecropping after it, rice farming requires capital, machinery, and technical knowledge. The land must be leveled precisely for irrigation. The fields must be flooded and drained according to exact schedules. Harvesting requires specialized equipment. This means the rice farmers are not desperate sharecroppers, but relatively prosperous commercial farmers, many of them transplants from the Midwest who brought capital and mechanical expertise. They are Perley's kind of people, business-minded, focused on profit margins, willing to invest in quality goods if those goods increase yields. Moreover, the rice industry is just beginning its expansion. The Southern Pacific Railroad is extending lines throughout southwestern Louisiana. New irrigation projects are opening thousands of additional acres to cultivation. Rice mills are being constructed at every major railroad junction. The region is experiencing the kind of explosive growth that Minnesota saw in the 1870s. Except here, the growing season never ends. Perley makes his decision with the same calculated precision his father would approve of. Kinder offers lower overhead than Crowley, less competition, and positioning along a railroad line that will inevitably bring increased traffic. The town is small enough that a well-run general store could quickly become the dominant commercial establishment, giving Perley the kind of economic leverage that translates to long-term prosperity. In early June, he negotiates a lease on a building near the Kinder depot. The structure is modest: 2 rooms, wooden construction, a covered porch suitable for displaying goods. The rent is reasonable. The location is ideal. He writes to his father explaining the decision, the business logic, the projected returns. James writes back with approval and a reminder that quarterly accounting is expected. Perley uses his $1,000 capital carefully. He purchases initial inventory through a wholesaler in Lake Charles. Dry goods, canned foods, work clothes, basic hardware, seed stock. He arranges credit with the wholesaler based on the strength of his capital reserves and his father's reputation. He places advertisements in the Crowley Signal and the Lake Charles newspaper announcing the opening of Wilder's general store in Kinder. The store opens on July 1st, 1895. The first day's receipts total $14.30, enough to cover a day's expenses with a small profit. But Perley is not measuring success in daily receipts. He is measuring it in customer relationships established, in credit extended to reliable farmers, in his growing understanding of what this community needs. By August, the store is generating steady business. Rice farmers stop in for supplies, for credit, for conversion. Perley learns their names, their family situations, their farming methods. He extends credit cautiously, always securing it against fall harvests. He keeps meticulous books, tracks every transaction, manages inventory with precision. Within 3 months, he is no longer a Minnesota farm boy playing at shopkeeper. He is becoming what he was always meant to be: a merchant, an economic anchor, a man building wealth through calculation rather than courage. The frontier does not require heroes. It requires accountants with vision. The Louisiana summer of 1895 teaches Perley lessons that Minnesota never offered. The heat is not just uncomfortable, it is a physical presence, an enemy that must be strategically managed. He learns to conduct business in the early morning and late evening, to retreat to shade during midday hours, to drink water constantly, and still feel perpetually thirsty. He loses 15 pounds in the first 2 months, his body adapting to a climate that seems designed to punish anyone from northern latitudes. But adaptation is what Perley does best. He always has. The store becomes his entire world. He lives in the back room, sleeping on a cot surrounded by inventory. His meals are simple, canned goods from his own shelves, occasional dinners with Laura Ann's family when he makes the trip to Crowley. He works 7 days a week, opening at dawn and closing only when the last customer leaves. The rice farmers appreciate this dedication. In a region where many businesses operate on relaxed southern schedules, Perley's Yankee work ethic stands out. Men know they can stop at Wilder's store before heading to the fields in the morning or after work in the evening. This reliability translates to loyalty, and loyalty translates to profit. By September, Perley has identified the key to success in this economy: credit. The rice farmers need seed, equipment, and supplies debris months before they harvest and sell their crops. A merchant who can extend credit carefully, with proper security, can lock in customers and charge premium prices. Perley establishes a system. He will extend credit up to 50% of a farmer's expected harvest value, secured by a lien on the growing crop. The interest rate is 12% annually, high enough to be profitable, low enough to be competitive. This credit system requires trust and judgment. Perley must assess each farmer's character, work ethic, and prospects. He develops an instinct for this, learned partly from watching his father evaluate business partners in Minnesota, and partly from hard experience. When Lars Bergeron, a rice farmer from Iowa, asks for $100 in credit, Perley visits his farm, inspects his fields, talks to his neighbours. Satisfied that Bergeron is reliable, he extends the credit. When Bergeron's harvest comes in strong and he repays promptly, Perley gains both profit and a loyal customer. Not every judgment is correct. In October, a farmer named Robichaud defaults on $40 in credit, and Perley must pursue collection through legal channels. He recovers $28 and learns a valuable lesson about assessing character. He begins requiring 2 references for any credit extension over $50. As autumn arrives, though autumn in Louisiana looks nothing like Minnesota's explosion of colour, the store's monthly receipts reach a level that would have seemed impossible in July. Perley is clearing nearly $200 profit per month after expenses and inventory replenishment. At this rate, he will repay his father's $500 investment within a year, ahead of schedule. But profit is not his only focus. Perley is building something more valuable than money. He is building position. In a small town like Kinder, the general store is more than a business. It is an institution. It is where news is exchanged, where mail is collected before there is an official post office, where farmers gather to discuss crop prices and railroad rates. Perley positions himself at the centre of this network, listening more than talking, remembering every detail, understanding that information is as valuable as inventory. He also begins observing the broader social dynamics of Louisiana. This is not Minnesota. The racial hierarchies here are more rigid, more violent, more explicitly enforced. Perley serves both white and black customers, but he quickly learns the unspoken rules: separate entrances, different credit term, careful navigation of power structures that can turn deadly for those who violate them. He does not challenge these systems. He is a merchant, not a reformer, but he notes their existence, their impact on commerce, their fundamental difference from the immigrant class dynamics of Minnesota. By December, as Minnesota endures blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, Perley tends his store in weather that requires nothing more than a light jacket. He writes to his mother, describing orange trees bearing fruit in winter, of fields being prepared for spring planting while Minnesota farms lie buried under snow. He does not mention loneliness or homesickness. Frontier men do not acknowledge such weaknesses. On Christmas Day, Laura Ann and her family visit. They bring food, conversation, and the comfort of family connection. Laura Ann approves of what her youngest brother has built. She sees the same calculating intelligence their father possessed, the same ability to identify opportunity and execute efficiently. "You'll do well here," she tells him. Perley nods. He already knows who he is. The question was never whether he would succeed, it was only how quickly. As 1895 ends and 1896 begins, Perley Day Wilder has established himself in Louisiana. He has a profitable business, a growing reputation, and capital accumulating faster than he projected. What he does not yet have is what every successful frontier merchant eventually requires: a family, a permanent stake in the community, the social legitimacy that only marriage provides. That will come. Everything comes to those who calculate correctly and wait for the right moment. The frontier rewards patience as much as courage, sometimes more. By the spring of 1897, Perley Day Wilder has what every ambitious man needs: a successful business, a respected position in the community, and enough capital to consider the future beyond the next harvest season. What he lacks is a wife, and in the social economy of small-town Louisiana, this absence becomes increasingly conspicuous. The question is not whether Perley will marry, but whom he will choose. Marriage on the frontier, even this industrializing, railroad-connected frontier, remains a calculated decision. A wife brings labor, social connections, potential children to inherit the business, and the kind of domestic stability that transforms a merchant from temporary resident to permanent community fixture. Elsie Lillian Merritt enters Perley's life the way most things in Kinder do, through the store. She is the daughter of a rice farming family that settled in Allen Parish in the early 1890s, part of the wave of agricultural migrants drawn by Louisiana's rice boom. The Merritts are not wealthy, but they are respectable, landowners rather than sharecroppers, literate, church-going people who they understand the value of commercial relationships. Elsie is somewhere between 18 and 22 years old, frontier record-keeping being imprecise about women's birth dates, when she first walks into Wilder's general store with her mother. Perley notices her the way a merchant notices everything. methodically assessing value and potential. She is plain-featured but healthy-looking, with the kind of practical competence that shows in how she examines dry goods, calculating quality against price. She does not giggle or simper like some of the younger girls. She evaluates fabric the way Perley evaluates credit applications, seriously. The courtship that follows is neither romantic nor prolonged. Perley is 28 years old and practical. Elsie is of marriageable age and from a family that would benefit from alliance with an established merchant. The negotiations, and frontier marriages are negotiations, however much later generations dress them up as love stories, proceed through appropriate channels. Perley calls on the Merritt farm on Sunday afternoons, the only time a merchant can spare from business. He speaks with Elsie's father about crop yields and railroad rates. He speaks with Elsie about household management and religious observance. They are not discovering soulmates. They are conducting mutual assessments of compatibility and utility. The wedding takes place in November of 1897, a modest ceremony at the church in Kinder. There is no honeymoon. Merchants cannot abandon their stores for frivolous travel. Instead, Elsie moves into the rooms behind the store, and the practical work of building a frontier marriage begins. What survives in the historical record about Elsie Lillian Merritt Wilder is sparse. She appears in census records as a wife, as a mother, as a woman whose existence is documented primarily through her relationship to men. But reading between those sparse lines reveals a pattern. She managed the household finances, raised 6 children in the back rooms of a general store, survived the isolation and drudgery of frontier domesticity, and never once appears in local records as a source of scandal or disruption. In other words, she did exactly what frontier wives were expected to do. She made herself essential while remaining invisible. The marriage brings Perley precisely what he calculated it would bring. Elsie's family becomes reliable customers, their extended network of farming connections flowing through Wilder's general store. Her labour in the household frees Perley to focus entirely on business. Her presence signals to the community that Perley is not a transient opportunist, but a man building permanent roots. Within 3 months of the wedding, Elsie is pregnant with their first child. Within a year, the store's back rooms echo with infant cries. The transformation from bachelor merchant to family man is complete, but something else shifts in this period that will prove equally significant to Perley's long-term success. In early 1898, the United States Postal Service designates Kinder as an official post office location, and Perley Day Wilder receives the appointment as postmaster. This is not merely honorary. The postmaster position carries federal authority, a modest salary, and most importantly, guaranteed foot traffic. Every person in Kinder and the surrounding farms must come to the post office to send and receive mail. By housing the post office within his general store, Perley ensures that every postal customer is also a potential retail customer. The appointment also signals something about Perley's political connections. Postmaster positions in this era are political patronage, awarded based on party loyalty and local influence. That Perley receives this appointment, a Yankee transplant in a region still processing Reconstruction's aftermath, indicates he has successfully navigated Louisiana's complex political landscape. He has made the right friend, supported the right candidates, positioned himself as reliable and non-threatening to local power structures. The store expands. The back rooms that once housed only Perley's cot now accommodate a growing family. He leases additional space, builds additions, transforms the modest 2-room structure into something more substantial. By 1899, Wilder's general store and post office occupies a prominent position on Kinder's main street, its false front facade presenting an image of permanence and prosperity. Letters arrive from Minnesota with increasing irregularity. James Wilder is aging, his correspondence becoming shakier. Angelina writes occasionally, her maternal concern focusing on whether Perley attends church regularly and treats his wife properly. Almanzo and Laura have left Spring Valley again, drifting toward Missouri, still searching for the prosperity that continues to elude them. Perley reads these letters and recognizes the divergence that began when he was 10 years old has now become a chasm. His brother chases an idealized vision of frontier independence, land ownership, agricultural self-sufficiency, the romance of the homestead. Perley has chosen the merchant's path, commercial success, community integration, calculated accumulation. By the end of 1899, there is no question which path is succeeding. The dawn of the 20th century finds Perley Day Wilder at the peak of his early success. He is 31 years old, the father of a healthy son named James, the proprietor of Kinder's most successful commercial establishment, and the postmaster of a growing railroad town. The $1,000 he brought to Louisiana 5 years ago has multiplied into a commercial operation worth several $1,000s in inventory, property, and credit accounts. But the new century brings changes that will test even Perley's careful planning. The rice industry, which seemed poised for unlimited expansion in the 1890s, begins experiencing the boom and bust cycles characteristic of agricultural commodities. Overproduction drives prices down. Some of the more marginal farmers, those who expanded too aggressively on credit, begin defaulting on debts. Perley's carefully managed credit portfolio shows some strain, not enough to threaten his solvency, but enough to remind him that even calculated risks remain risks. He responds the way he always responds, by tightening credit requirements, diversifying inventory toward less agriculture-dependent goods, and maintaining cash reserves against future downturns. While other merchants panic or overextend trying to maintain sales volumes, Perley contracts slightly, prioritizes reliability over growth, and waits for weaker competitors to fail. 2 smaller stores in Kinder close their doors in 1900 and 1901. Their inventory is liquidated at desperate prices. Perley purchases selectively, acquiring goods at 30 cents on the dollar and reselling them through his own establishment at normal markup. Crisis for others becomes opportunity for the prepared. The second child, Gladys, arrives in 1905, then Harold in 1909. The back rooms of the store transform into a domestic warren, children sleeping in shifts, Elsie managing cooking, cleaning, and childcare while also assisting with store operations during busy periods. The arrangement would seem chaotic to outside observers, but frontier families have always mixed domestic and commercial life. Children grow up measuring flour and counting change before they learn to read. Perley's relationship with his children follows the pattern established by his own father. Practical, focused on preparing them for useful futures, short on sentimentality. His sons will learn merchantry and accounting. His daughters will learn household management and enough arithmetic to avoid being cheated in commercial transactions. Education matters, but only insofar as it provides practical utility. In 1903, Kinder is officially incorporated as a village by Louisiana Governor William Hurd. This administrative formalization brings new regulations, property taxes, and bureaucratic complexity. It also brings legitimacy. Kinder is no longer a frontier settlement but a legally recognized municipality. Perley, as one of the town's leading businessmen, participates in the incorporation proceedings, ensuring that tax assessments and commercial regulations favor established merchants over potential competitors. The political skills he has been developing since arriving in Louisiana serve him well. He understands that success in small-town commerce requires not just business acumen, but political positioning. He contributes to the right campaigns, attends the right meetings, maintains cordial relationships with parish officials. He never seeks elected office. Merchants who become politicians often alienate half their customers. But he ensures that those who do hold office understand his interests. News from Minnesota arrives with the irregularity of seasonal change, though the content varies. James Mason Wilder dies in May of 1899 at age 86, having lived long enough to see his calculated westward gamble pay off for at least one son. His will divides the Spring Valley property among the surviving children. Perley's share, inherited at the same moment he is establishing himself in Louisiana, provides additional capital that he immediately reinvests in expanding his inventory and building a proper family residence separate from the store. Angelina outlives her husband by 6 years, dying in 1905 at age 84. The letters announcing her death reach Louisiana weeks after the burial. Perley cannot attend the funeral, the distance is too great, the store cannot be abandoned for weeks of travel. He marks her passing with a donation to the Kinder Methodist Church and moves forward. Frontier life has always required the ability to grieve efficiently and continue working. Almanzo and Laura's trajectory continues downward, at least from a commercial perspective. They drift from South Dakota to Missouri to various points in between, always farming, never quite achieving the prosperity that seems to come so easily to others. Their letters, which have arrived sporadically, speak of hard work and modest harvests, but never of the kind of capital accumulation that Perley achieves through commerce. The contrast between the brothers' lives has become stark. Almanzo, the adventurous homesteader, remains perpetually on the edge of subsistence. Perley, the cautious merchant, builds steady wealth, The frontier mythology celebrates Almanzo's type, but the bank accounts celebrate Perley's approach. By 1910, Wilder's general store has become an institution in Kinder. Men gather on the porch to discuss politics and crops. Women purchase fabric and canned goods. Children press their noses against the glass jars of penny candy. The post office window, operated by Perley himself, processes mail for a community that has grown to nearly 500 residents. Perley is no longer a newcomer or a Yankee outsider. He is Mr. Wilder, postmaster and merchant, a man whose opinion carries weight in community decisions, whose credit can make or break a farming operation, whose store serves as the commercial heart of the town. He has become exactly what he set out to become: essential, prosperous, secure. The fourth child, Perley Jr., arrives in 1912, the fifth, Dorothy, in 1914, the sixth and final child, John, in 1916. 6 children total, a substantial family by any standard, a labour force and legacy by frontier calculation. The great question becomes, what will these children inherit? The years between 1910 and 1920 represent Perley's consolidation phase, the period when early success transforms into permanent establishment. The rice industry stabilises after its volatile early years, settling into predictable cycles of production and price fluctuation. Kinder grows steadily, its population reaching 800 by 1915, its commercial district expanding along the railroad line. Perley's store evolves with the town's growth. What began as a simple dry goods operation now stocks a comprehensive inventory: agricultural implements, household goods, patent medicines, work clothes, luxury items like tobacco and coffee, and increasingly the manufactured consumer goods that American industry is producing in ever greater quantities. The store becomes a kind of museum of early 20th century commerce, shelves lined with products whose brand names will still be recognized a century later. The credit system that Perley established in the 1890s matures into something more sophisticated. He maintains detailed ledgers tracking every farmer's credit history, repayment patterns, and reliability. This information gives him power that exceeds mere commercial advantage. He knows which farms are succeeding and which are failing, which families are rising and which are desperate. In a small town, this knowledge translates to influence. But Perley wields this influence carefully. He is not a loan shark or a predatory lender. His interest rates, while profitable, remain competitive. He extends grace periods when harvests fail through no fault of the farmer. He understands that his long-term prosperity depends on the community's overall health. A town full of bankrupt farmers cannot support a general store. This balance between profit and community sustainability marks Perley as a merchant of a particular type, the kind who builds institutions rather than merely extracting wealth. He is not beloved exactly, merchants rarely are, but he is respected, trusted to deal fairly, relied upon as a permanent fixture in the community's economic landscape. The rice farming economy that surrounds Kinder in these years represents something unique in southern agricultural history. Unlike cotton cultivation with its legacy of slavery and sharecropping exploitation, rice farming requires capital investment, mechanical knowledge, and sophisticated water management. The farmers are commercial operators, not subsistence peasants. This creates a customer base that Perley can work with, men who understand credit, who plan for market fluctuations, who invest in quality equipment because it increases yields. Perley's role as postmaster also evolves during this period. What began as a simple mail distribution operation expands as the postal service itself modernizes. Rural free delivery begins reaching outlying farms. Parcel post service starts in 1913, allowing farmers to order goods directly from distant suppliers, a development that could threaten Perley's retail business, but which he adapts to by offering to process mail orders for a small fee, turning potential competition into additional revenue. In 1912, Allen Parish is officially created from Calcasieu Parish, and Kinder finds itself within this new administrative unit. Perley participates in the political manoeuvring that accompanies parish formation, ensuring that Kinder receives favourable treatment in road construction, public improvements, and administrative attention. He never runs for office, but he cultivates relationships with those who do, understanding that in small-town Louisiana, commerce and politics are inseparable. The children grow up immersed in the rhythms of store life. James, the eldest, begins learning bookkeeping as soon as he can write legibly. Gladys helps her mother manage the household while also assisting with retail operations. Harold shows aptitude for inventory management and supplier negotiations. The younger children, Perley, Jr., Dorothy, and John, grow up understanding that the store is not just their father's business, but the family's collective enterprise. Elsie manages this domestic commercial hybrid with the kind of invisible competence that characterizes successful frontier women. She feeds 6 children on a merchant's irregular schedule, maintains cleanliness in rooms attached to a commercial establishment, teaches daughters the domestic skills they will need, while also ensuring they understand retail arithmetic. Her labour makes Perley's success possible, yet the historical record barely acknowledges her existence beyond census entries and birth records. This erasure is not accidental. The frontier narrative focuses on men's dramatic achievements while rendering women's essential labour invisible. Perley builds an empire, Elsie merely keeps house. Except that without her management of the domestic sphere, the empire would collapse. The meals she prepares, the children she raises, the household economy she maintains, all of this constitutes unpaid labour that subsidises commercial success. But Perley understands his wife's value, even if he never articulates it in sentimental terms. He ensures she has household help when the children are young, respects her judgment on credit extended to families she knows through church connections, and never publicly contradicts or embarrasses her. Their marriage is not romantic, but it is functional, and on the frontier, functionality matters more than romance. By the time the United States enters World War I in April of 1917, Perley Day Wilder has spent 22 years in Louisiana. He is 48 years old, the father of 6, the owner of Kinder's most successful business, a man whose net worth would seem substantial even in Spring Valley, Minnesota, where his journey began. The war will bring changes, commodity price spikes, labour shortages, new federal regulations, but Perley has weathered economic cycles before. He understands that every disruption creates winners and losers, and that preparation determines which category you occupy. He has always been prepared. It is the only skill that truly matters. The Great War transforms American agriculture overnight, and Perley Day Wilder watches commodity prices surge with the detached interest of a man who profits from volatility without being consumed by it. When the United States declares war on Germany in April of 1917, rice prices jump 30% within weeks. Farmers who struggled through lean years suddenly find themselves flush with cash, and cash-rich farmers spend freely at general stores. Perley's store sees record sales throughout 1917 and 1918. The increased demand for agricultural products means his farmer customers can afford better tools, more substantial purchases, luxury goods they previously considered frivolous, coffee, tobacco, canned delicacies, items that moved slowly in peacetime fly off the shelves during wartime prosperity. But Perley does not mistake temporary windfall for permanent condition. He has seen boom and bust cycles before. While other merchants expand aggressively, taking on debt to increase inventory and enlarge their establishments, Perley maintains his characteristic caution. He increases inventory modestly, takes advantage of higher sales volumes, but primarily uses war profits to pay down existing debts and accumulate cash reserves. This conservatism proves prescient when the war ends in November of 1918, and agricultural prices collapse almost immediately. The European markets that absorbed American surplus during wartime rebuild their own production. Domestic demand cannot compensate. By early 1919, rice prices have fallen 40% from their wartime peaks. Farmers who expanded operations based on inflated wartime prices suddenly cannot service their debts. Several operations around Kinder fail outright, their land and equipment auctioned to satisfy creditors. Perley attends these auctions not as a desperate seller, but as a cash buyer. He acquires farmland at Depression Prairie, not to operate it himself, he remains a merchant, not a farmer, but to rent it to more cautious operators at terms favourable to the landlord. This land acquisition marks an evolution in Perley's economic strategy. He is no longer merely a merchant, but a property owner, a landlord, a man with diversified income streams. The store remains his primary operation, but rental income from farmland provides stability when retail sales fluctuate. The post-war recession also eliminates some of Perley's commercial competition. 2 smaller general stores in Kinder close permanently, unable to survive the sudden contraction in customer spending. Their closure strengthens Perley's market position. By 1920, Wilder's general store faces no significant local competition. Anyone in Kinder or the surrounding farms who needs goods has essentially one choice: purchase from Perley or travel to Crowley or Lake Charles. This near-monopoly position allows Perley to maintain prices and profit margins that would be impossible in a competitive market. He is not gouging, his prices remain reasonable by regional standards, but he is no longer competing on price. He competes on convenience, credit availability, and the accumulated trust of 25 years in business. The 1920s arrive with the kind of prosperity that makes the wartime boom seem modest by comparison. The American economy enters a period of explosive growth. Automobiles become common even in rural Louisiana. Electricity reaches Kinder in 1922, and Perley installs electric lighting in his store, a visible symbol of modernity and progress. The roads improve, transitioning from muddy tracks to graded thoroughpaths that remain passable year-round. Perley is 51 years old in 1920, entering the phase of life when men either consolidate their achievements or watch them crumble. He chooses consolidation. The store continues operating profitably. The rental properties generate steady income. His children are growing into useful ages, the older ones now capable of managing store operations during Perley's absences. The younger ones still learning the family business. James, the eldest son, is 17 in 1920 and shows every sign of inheriting his father's commercial instincts. He manages inventory with precision, negotiates with suppliers effectively, and understands that success in retail requires balancing customer satisfaction against profit margins. Perley begins grooming him explicitly for eventual succession, teaching him the subtleties of credit evaluation, the importance of community relationships, the necessity of maintaining cash reserves against downturns. Gladys, 15, assists her mother with increasingly complex household management. The family has moved into a proper house, separate from the store, a 2-story structure that announces prosperity without ostentation. Harold, 11, shows aptitude for mechanical matters. He can repair almost anything, a valuable skill in an era when manufactured goods are expensive and replacement parts scarce. The younger children, Perley Jr. at 8, Dorothy at 6, John at 4, represent the next generation. Children who will grow up in prosperity rather than frontier uncertainty. They attend school regularly, eat well, wear store-bought clothes rather than hand-me-downs. The contrast with Perley's own childhood, moving from New York to Minnesota in a covered wagon, eating whatever the farm produced, could not be more stark. Perley has accomplished what his father set out to accomplish 30 years earlier. He has positioned his family for multi-generational prosperity. The Wilders are no longer striving newcomers, but established fixtures in their community's economic and social landscape. Yet even in this period of success, Perley maintains the habits that brought him here. He continues working 6 days a week, opening the store at dawn and closing at dusk. He maintains meticulous account books, tracking every penny of income and expense. He extends credit cautiously, collects debts firmly, and keeps substantial cash reserves against future uncertainty. Because Perley Day Wilder understands something that his brother Almanzo never quite grasped. Prosperity is not a destination but a process, not an achievement but a practice, not luck but the compound result of 10,000 small, careful decisions. The frontier rewarded the dramatic risk-takers with stories, but it rewarded the cautious calculators with wealth. In 1926, something happens 1,500 miles north of Kinder, Louisiana, that will eventually erase Perley Day Wilder from American memory. His sister-in-law, Laura Ingalls Wilder, now 59 years old and living on a farm in Mansfield, Missouri, begins writing down her childhood memories. Perley knows nothing of this development. He and Laura have had minimal contact since Almanzo and she left Spring Valley decades ago. The occasional letter arrives, usually around holidays, brief updates on family matters. Almanzo's health remains poor from the diphtheria that crippled him 40 years earlier. Their daughter Rose has become a writer, living in San Francisco, sending money to support her parents. The tone of these letters carries a weariness, a sense of lives that never quite achieved what they were meant to achieve. Perley reads these updates without comment. What can he say? That his own life has proceeded smoothly while his brother's has been marked by struggle and disappointment? That the choices each man made 40 years ago have led to predictably different outcomes? Such observations would be cruel, and Perley is not cruel. He is merely practical. What Perley does not know, what he cannot know in 1926, is that Laura is beginning to construct a narrative of frontier life that will sell millions of copies, spawn a television series, and embed itself in American mythology. a narrative that will celebrate Almanzo's wheat run through the blizzard, his homesteading courage, his embodiment of frontier virtues, a narrative that will never mention Perley Day Wilder at all. This erasure is not malicious. Laura writes about what she knows, her own childhood in various frontier towns, her courtship with Almanzo, their struggles in Dakota territory. Perley exists outside this story. He was not in Dakota during the long winter. He did not participate in the famous wheat run. He did not court Laura or struggle alongside her through drought and debt and disappointment. Perley's story is different, successful, sturable, and unspectacular. It does not feature blizzards or near starvation or dramatic rescues. It features careful inventory management, strategic credit extension, and compound interest. These things do not make for compelling children's literature, but they do make for comfortable retirement, which is what Perley begins contemplating as the 1920s progress. He's approaching 60, his children are grown or nearly so, and the store has provided more than enough capital to live comfortably for his remaining years. The decision to gradually withdraw from day-to-day operations comes in 1927. James, now 24, has proven himself capable of managing the store's operations. Perley begins spending fewer hours behind the counter, more hours managing his rental properties and financial investments. He purchases shares in the local bank, participates in financing for new commercial construction in Kinder, invests in the ongoing expansion of Louisiana's oil industry. This diversification into petroleum represents Perley's final major business decision. The discovery of oil in nearby parishes has created yet another boom in southwestern Louisiana. Men are becoming wealthy overnight from mineral rights and drilling operations. Perley, characteristically, does not gamble on wildcatting or speculative drilling. Instead, he invests in established operations, purchases proven mineral rights at fair prices, and accepts modest but reliable returns. The strategy works. By 1929, Perley's income from investments exceeds his income from the store. He has achieved what few frontier settlers ever accomplish. He has transformed labour income into capital income, has built wealth that generates more wealth without requiring his constant physical presence. The store itself, now managed primarily by James with Perley's oversight, continues its profitable operations. The post office remains housed within its walls, ensuring steady traffic. The inventory has evolved with the times, less agricultural equipment, more consumer goods, reflecting Kinder's transformation from frontier settlement to established small town. Perley also maintains his property holdings, now substantial enough to generate significant rental income. He owns commercial buildings on Kinder's main street, residential properties rented to working families, and farmland leased to operators who lack capital to purchase their own acreage. This makes him one of Kinder's larger landlords, a position that carries both economic benefits and social obligations. He is expected to contribute to civic improvements, to support the Methodist Church, to participate in community decision-making. He does all of this without seeking prominence or recognition. His contributions are substantial but quiet. He is not a man who needs to see his name on public buildings or memorial plaques. This humility, or perhaps this privacy, contributes to his historical invisibility. Loud men get remembered. Generous but quiet men get forgotten. Perley built a commercial empire in Louisiana and raised 6 children to productive adulthood, but he did it without drama, without publicity, without creating the kind of compelling narrative that survives in collective memory. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away, Laura continues writing her stories. She writes about Pa's fiddle and Ma's careful housekeeping and the little house on the prairie. She writes about survival and struggle and the virtues of self-reliance. She creates a mythology of frontier life that emphasizes individual courage over commercial calculation, homesteading over merchantry, dramatic risk over careful planning. It is a compelling mythology. Americans will love it. They will teach it to their children and make television shows about it and visit the historical sites where Laura lived. But it's only one story of frontier America. Perley Day Wilder represents another story, quieter, less dramatic, but in its own way equally significant. The story of those who built America's commercial infrastructure, who transformed frontier settlements into functioning communities, who accumulated wealth through patience rather than heroism. Until now. The year 1929 begins with the kind of optimism that only a long boom can create. The American economy has grown for nearly a decade. Stock prices reach heights that seem to defy gravity. Even in rural Louisiana, Even in a small town like Kinder, the prosperity feels permanent, inevitable, unshakable. Perley Day Wilder, 60 years old and experienced enough to recognize dangerous exuberance, watches the speculation with growing unease. He reads about stock market valuations that make no economic sense, about people mortgaging farms to invest in securities they do not understand, about banks extending credit based on collateral whose value rests entirely on the assumption that prices will continue rising forever. He has seen this pattern before: the rice boom of the 1890s, the wartime commodity surge. Every boom eventually breaks. The only questions are when and how severe. In August of 1929, Perley makes a decision that will prove either paranoid or prescient. He liquidates his stock market investments, not all of them, but enough to build his cash reserves to levels that exceed any reasonable need. His bank shares he keeps. Banks serve essential functions and survive most economic disruptions. His oil investments he keeps. Petroleum has genuine utility beyond speculation. But the stocks purchased purely for appreciation, the shares in companies he does not understand and cannot evaluate, those he sells. His son James questions this decision. The market continues rising through September. Selling seems to be leaving money on the table. On October the 29th, 1929, the stock market collapses. The ticker tape cannot keep up with sell orders. Fortunes evaporate. Banks that extended credit against stock collateral suddenly face insolvency. The Great Depression, though no one calls it that yet, begins. Kinda. Louisiana feels the effects within weeks. Commodity prices collapse. The rice farmers, already operating on thin margins, watch their expected harvest revenues drop by half. Some can weather this storm, many cannot. The banks, overextended and holding mortgages on property whose value is plummeting, begin failing. Perley watches the panic with the grim satisfaction of a man whose paranoia proved justified. His cash reserves position him not as a victim, but as an opportunity. When desperate farmers need to sell land to satisfy creditors, Perley has capital to purchase. When failing businesses liquidate inventory, he can acquire goods at catastrophic discounts. This is not altruism. This is not even particularly sympathetic. But it is how economic downturns redistribute wealth from the unprepared to the prepared, from the optimistic to the cautious, from those who believed in permanent prosperity to those who never stopped preparing for disaster. The early 1930s in Kinder are marked by a kind of quiet desperation. Unemployment rises. Families that seemed secure suddenly line up for charity. The optimism of the 20s evaporates like morning dew under the Louisiana sun. Men who owned farms become tenant farmers. Men who owned businesses become employees. The economic pyramid that seemed so stable reveals itself to have been built on sand. Wilder's general store continues operating, though at reduced volumes. People still need basic goods: food, clothing, essential supplies. They have less money to spend, but complete cessation of commerce never occurs. Perley adjusts by reducing inventory of luxury items, focusing on staples, and extending credit even more cautiously than usual. The post office, still operated within the store, continues generating traffic and modest income. Federal employment is one of the few reliable sources of payment during the Depression, and the postmaster position provides Perley with guaranteed income when private commerce falters. His rental properties become more problematic. Tenants who could pay rent in good times struggle during Depression. Evicting families creates social tension and often proves economically pointless. Empty buildings generate no revenue. Perley navigates this by accepting reduced rents, sometimes accepting labour in lieu of cash payment, maintaining relationships that will prove valuable when prosperity returns. Because Perley understands what the panicked do not, the Depression, like all economic cycles, will eventually end. Those who survive with their assets intact will be positioned for the next boom. Those who liquidate in panic, who sell property at Depression prices to satisfy immediate needs, will lose everything. His children, now adults, face the Depression with the skills their father taught them. James manages the store with the same cautious competence that Perley himself would employ. Gladys, married now with her own family, maintains household economy through the lean years. Harold finds work with his mechanical skills, always in demand regardless of economic conditions. The younger children, Perley Jr., Dorothy, and John, enter adulthood during the worst economic collapse in American history. The world they inherit is harsher, more uncertain, more demanding than the prosperous 20s suggested it would be. But they are Perley Day Wilder's children. They were raised by a man who never believed prosperity was permanent, who always maintained reserves against disaster, who understood that survival requires preparation more than hope. They will survive. The Wilder family has always survived, not through heroic gestures or dramatic risks, but through patient calculation and refusing to mistake temporary conditions for permanent reality. The Depression will break many families, but it will not break the descendants of a man who spent 60 years preparing for exactly this kind of catastrophe. The Great Depression settles over southwestern Louisiana like a slow-moving flood, rising inch by inch until it touches everything. By 1930, the optimism of the previous decade has been completely submerged beneath unemployment, foreclosures, and the quiet desperation of families watching their security evaporate. Perley Day Wilder, now 61 years old, has weathered economic storms before, but this one carries a different character. Previous downturns were sharp and temporary, commodity price drops, seasonal disruptions, brief panics that resolved within months. The Depression shows no signs of ending. It deepens month after month, year after year, until the prosperity of the 20s begins to feel like a collective hallucination. The rice farmers around Kinder struggle to survive on prices that barely cover production costs. Those who borrowed heavily during the boom years face impossible choices: default on mortgages and lose their land, or continue pouring labour into operations that generate no profit. Several choose a third option. They simply abandon their farms and drift away, joining the growing army of displaced agricultural workers searching for employment that does not exist. Wilder's general store adapts to this new reality. The inventory shifts toward absolute necessities. Gone are the luxury goods that lined the shelves during prosperous times, the imported tobaccos, the fancy canned delicacies, the fashionable fabrics. In their place, flour, cornmeal, lard, the basics of subsistence. Even these move slowly. Families who once shopped weekly now appear every 2 weeks, every month, purchasing only what they absolutely cannot produce themselves. Credit becomes simultaneously more essential and more dangerous. Farmers need credit to purchase seed for spring planting, but their ability to repay that credit depends on harvest prices that remain catastrophically low. Perley extends credit more cautiously than ever, requiring not just liens on crops, but personal guarantees, co-signers, collateral that retains value even in depression conditions. Some of his credit decisions prove correct. The farmer repays from harvest proceeds, maintains his relationship with the store, survives to farm another year. Other decisions prove disastrous. The farmer defaults, the collateral proves worthless. Perley absorbs the loss. He maintains meticulous records of both outcomes, learning which types of operations can survive depression conditions and which cannot. The post office continues operating, a small island of federal reliability in an ocean of private sector collapse. Perley's salary as postmaster, modest but guaranteed, provides income that does not depend on customer spending or agricultural prices. In an era when many men lose everything, this guaranteed federal employment represents security that proves more valuable than any amount of speculative profit from the boom years. His rental properties present ongoing challenges. Tenants who cannot pay rent cannot be easily replaced. There are no prospective renters with money waiting to take their place. Eviction accomplishes nothing except creating empty buildings that generate no revenue while still requiring property tax payments. Perley navigates this by accepting what tenants can pay, sometimes reducing rents to levels that barely cover his costs, maintaining occupancy in hopes that economic recovery will eventually allow rent increases. This pragmatism keeps his properties occupied and maintained. Other landlords who insist on full rent payments end up with empty buildings that deteriorate from neglect. Perley's approach sacrifices short-term income for long-term asset preservation, a characteristic calculation that defines his entire approach to business. The 1930s census captures a snapshot of Perley's life at 61. He is listed as merchant general store, living in Kinder with his wife Elsie and their adult children who have not yet married and established independent households. His property holdings, while not detailed in the census itself, would be recorded in parish tax records as substantial. Commercial buildings, residential properties, farmland, all slowly appreciating assets that will regain their full value when prosperity returns. If prosperity returns. By 1930, many Americans have begun wondering whether the Depression represents not a temporary downturn, but a permanent transformation, the end of the growth economy that defined the previous 50 years. Perley does not share this pessimism. He has lived through 61 years of American history, has witnessed the Civil War's aftermath, the Panic of 1893, the agricultural depressions of the 1890s, the post-war recession of 1919. Every collapse eventually resolved, every depression eventually lifted. The timeline might be uncertain, but the direction was not. His health, which remained robust through 6 decades, begins showing signs of age. The physical labour of operating a store, lifting inventory, standing for hours, managing the endless details of retail commerce, becomes more taxing. He delegates more responsibility to his son James, who now effectively manages daily operations, while Perley provides oversight and handles major decisions. This gradual transition from active management to semi-retirement is typical for successful merchants of his era. The business remains family-operated, passing from father to son without formal sale or transfer, continuing under the same name and practices that established its reputation. Wilder's general store will outlive Perley Day Wilder, will continue serving Kinder for years after his death, a monument to commercial success built through 6 decades of careful management. But Perley's own time is running shorter. He does not know this yet. There are no warning signs, no obvious illness, but the clock that began ticking on June 13, 1869 in Malone, New York is approaching its final hours. The depression continues. Kinder endures. The store operates at reduced capacity but operates nonetheless. And Perley Day Wilder, the youngest son who became a merchant prince, enters the final years of a life that followed every rule of frontier success except one. He never became famous. Fame, he would likely observe, does not pay the bills. Profit does, and profit he achieved in abundance. By 1932, the Depression has ground on for 3 years with no end in sight. Franklin Roosevelt's election brings hope to millions of Americans desperate for change, for government action, for anything that might reverse the downward spiral. The New Deal programs begin flowing into rural communities. Agricultural support, employment programs, banking reforms. Perley watches these developments with the skeptical eye of a man who has never relied on government assistance. The programs help some of his customers, provide employment for young men through the Civilian Conservation Corps, stabilize agricultural prices through production controls. But Perley has survived the Depression through private resources, his cash reserves, his diversified income streams, his decades of preparation for exactly this kind of catastrophe. His approach to the Depression, like his approach to everything else, has been fundamentally conservative. Maintain assets, reduce expenses, preserve capital, wait for recovery. This strategy lacks drama. There are no heroic gestures, no bold risks, no compelling stories. There is only patient endurance, careful management, and the compound benefit of decades of preparation. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles north, his sister-in-law Laura Ingalls Wilder is experiencing a different kind of success. It tells the story of her childhood in Wisconsin, of her father's fiddle playing and her mother's careful housekeeping, of frontier life rendered in prose that captures something essential about American mythology. The book finds an audience. In the depths of the Depression, when present circumstances seem hopeless, Americans hungry for stories about simpler times, about self-reliance and family values and frontier virtues, embrace Laura's nostalgic vision. The book sells well enough that her publisher requests a sequel. Perley learns of this development through the family correspondence network that has grown increasingly attenuated over the decades. A letter arrives from one of his siblings, perhaps Eliza Jane, perhaps Alice, mentioning that Laura has become an author, that her book about childhood is finding success. The letter is brief, the information presented as minor family news rather than major achievement. Perley reads this information without particular interest. His sister-in-law has written a book about her childhood. That is pleasant, he supposes, though he cannot imagine why anyone would purchase such a thing. He has more pressing concerns, managing inventory during the Depression, collecting on delinquent credit accounts, maintaining rental properties with tenants who can barely pay. What he does not know, what he cannot know in 1932, is that Laura's literary success will eventually erase him from American memory more completely than any deliberate conspiracy could achieve. Her books will be read by millions. They will be taught in schools, adapted for television, embedded in the national consciousness as the definitive account of frontier life. And nowhere in those books will Perley Day Wilder appear, not because Laura bears him any ill will, they barely know each other, but simply because he exists outside her story. He was not in Wisconsin during her childhood. He was not in Dakota during the long winter. He did not participate in the dramatic events that form the core of her narrative. His story is different. A youngest son who went south instead of west, who chose commerce over homesteading, who built wealth through patient accumulation rather than dramatic risk. It is a story equally representative of frontier America, perhaps more representative given that successful merchants outnumbered successful homesteaders by substantial margins. But it is not the story Americans want to hear. They want Laura's story, the little house, the covered wagon, the brave settlers facing down blizzards and locusts and all the dramatic perils of frontier life. They want heroes, not accountants. They want adventure, not inventory management. So Perley's story remains untold, buried in parish records and store ledgers and census entries. The historical invisibility that he cultivated during his life, the preference for privacy over prominence, for quiet success over public recognition, becomes permanent erasure after his death. In 1933, as Laura publishes her second book Farmer Boy about Almanzo's childhood in New York, Perley's health begins its final decline. He is 64 years old, and the cumulative weight of 6 decades is catching up. He has never been seriously ill, has enjoyed robust health that allowed him to work long hours into his early 60s. But now fatigue comes more easily. Tasks that once seemed trivial become exhausting. He does not complain. Frontier men of his generation do not acknowledge weakness or seek sympathy. He simply adjusts, works shorter hours, delegates more responsibility to James, spends more time in the residence and less time in the store. Elsie, now in her mid-50s, manages the household with the same competent invisibility that has characterized her entire marriage. She ensures he eats properly, rests adequately, maintains the routines that have structured their decades together. Their marriage has never been romantic, but it has been functional, and functionality matters more than passion when building a life. The children are grown now, scattered across Louisiana and beyond, building their own lives with the skills and capital their father provided. James runs the store, Gladys manages her own household, Harold works as a mechanic. The younger children are establishing themselves in various trades and professions. Perley has done what fathers are supposed to do. He has provided for his children, educated them in practical matters, positioned them for economic security. Whether they will achieve the same level of success he did remains to be seen, but he has given them the foundation. That is all any father can do. The spring of 1934 arrives with the kind of weather that makes Louisiana bearable. Warm but not yet scorching, humid but not oppressive. The rice fields around Kinder show the green shoots of spring's planting. The depression continues, but with slightly less intensity than previous years. Roosevelt's programs are having modest effects. Commodity prices remain low, but have stopped falling. There is a sense, however tentative, that the worst might be over. Perley Day Wilder does not live to see the recovery. On May 10, 1934, at age 64, Perley dies in Kinder, Louisiana. What is recorded is the outcome. Perley Day Wilder, born June 13, 1869 in Malone, New York, died May 10, 1934 in Kinder, Louisiana, after 65 years of life that spanned the complete transformation of American frontier society. The funeral is held at the Kinder Methodist Church, the institution to which Perley contributed financially for nearly 4 decades. The service is well attended, merchants who knew him as a fair competitor, farmers who bought goods on credit, tenants who rented his properties, community members who respected his position as postmaster and businessman. The minister delivers a eulogy that emphasizes Perley's commercial success, his family devotion, his contributions to community development. What the eulogy does not mention, what nobody present would think to mention, is that the deceased was the brother-in-law of Laura Ingalls Wilder, whose books are beginning to find a national audience. That connection seems trivial, a minor detail in the life of a man whose significance derives from his own achievements rather than his family relationships. The burial takes place at Kinder McGill Memorial Cemetery, a modest graveyard that serves the town's Protestant community. The gravestone is simple, recording basic facts: name, birth date, death date. There is no flowery epitaph, no lengthy description of achievements. Frontier gravestones tend toward brevity. Perley's estate, when settled, reveals the success he achieved through 40 years of commercial operations. He owns the general store building and inventory, multiple rental properties in Kinder, farmland in Allen Parish, shares in the local bank, and cash reserves that even depression conditions have not depleted. The total value, calculated for estate tax purposes, marks him as one of Kinder's more substantial citizens. The estate is divided among his heirs according to Louisiana law and Perley's will. Elsie receives the widow's portion. James, who has been managing the store, inherits the commercial operation. The other children receive shares of the rental properties and cash reserves. The distribution is equitable, practical, designed to minimize family conflict while preserving the wealth Perley accumulated. Elsie continues living in Kinder, supported by her inheritance and the ongoing profits from properties she now owns out and out. The store continues operating under James's management, still bearing the Wilder name, still serving Kinder's commercial needs. It will survive the remainder of the Depression, will prosper during the World War II economic boom, will eventually be sold or closed as chain stores and supermarkets transform rural American commerce in the post-war era. But that is future history. In May of 1934, the immediate impact of Perley's death is simply a void in Kinder's commercial and social landscape. A man who occupied a central position in the community's economy for 40 years has departed, leaving children and property and a legacy of successful commercial operation. What Perley does not leave is fame, recognition beyond his immediate community, or any trace in the historical narratives that will define frontier America for future generations. When Laura's books become bestsellers, when the television series makes Little House on the Prairie a cultural touchstone, when millions of Americans learn about Almanzo Wilder's dramatic wheat run through the blizzard, Perley will remain absent from every account. His erasure is complete, total, and entirely predictable. He lived a life that defied the frontier mythology Americans prefer to celebrate. He did not homestead. He did not face dramatic survival challenges. He did not embody the romantic ideals of frontier independence and agricultural self-sufficiency. He was a merchant who arrived with capital, who extended credit at profitable interest rates, who accumulated property through foreclosures and strategic purchases, who built wealth through commercial operation rather than agricultural labour. His success was real but unglamorous, profitable but unromantic, substantial but invisible to anyone who was not directly involved in Kinder's economic life. The American frontier produced millions of men like Perley Day Wilder, merchants, landlords, creditors, commercial operators who built the economic infrastructure that transformed wilderness into civilization. Their collective contributions made settlement possible, provided the goods and credit that sustained agricultural operations, created the market structures that connected rural communities to national and international commerce. But their stories remain untold, buried beneath the weight of more dramatic narratives about brave homesteaders and heroic survival. Perley would not have minded this obscurity. He never sought fame. He sought profit, security, and family prosperity. He achieved all three. That should have been enough. In the months following Perley's death, life in Kinder continues its ordinary rhythms. The store operates under James's management. Elsie settles into widowhood with the financial security her husband's decades of work provided. The Depression grinds on, though with signs of slow improvement. The world does not pause to mark the passing of one Louisiana merchant. But in Mansfield, Missouri, something is happening that will eventually define how Americans remember the Wilder family, and simultaneously ensure that Perley Day Wilder disappears from that memory entirely. Laura Ingalls Wilder, now 67 years old, is experiencing success she never imagined during the decades of agricultural struggle. Her third book, Little House on the Prairie, published in 1935, finds an even larger audience than her previous works. Children and adults alike are captivated by her stories of frontier life, of covered wagons and log cabins, of encounters with Native Americans and struggles against natural disasters. The books are particularly resonant during the Depression. Americans facing economic catastrophe find comfort in stories about earlier generations who survived hardship through self-reliance, family solidarity, and frontier virtues. Laura's prose offers both nostalgia and inspiration, a reminder that Americans have endured difficult times before and emerged stronger. What her readers do not fully understand is that they are reading carefully constructed narratives, not documentary accounts. Laura is writing literature, not history. She compresses timelines, omits inconvenient details, emphasizes dramatic moments while minimizing mundane reality. This is not deception, it is storytelling, the transformation of lived experience into compelling narrative. But the line between story and history becomes blurred when millions of readers accept Laura's accounts as factual records of frontier life. What she omits ceases to exist in public memory. Perley Day Wilder is omitted. This erasure is not malicious. Laura has no reason to include Almanzo's youngest brother in books about her own childhood and early married life. Perley was not present during the event she describes. He did not live in De Smet during the long winter. He did not participate in the wheat run that saved the town from starvation. He was not part of Laura and Almanzo's courtship or early marriage. Perley's story happened elsewhere, in Minnesota and Louisiana, far from the settings Laura writes about. His success came through commerce rather than agriculture, through patient accumulation rather than dramatic survival. His life lacks the narrative elements that make Laura's books compelling. There is no desperate struggle, no heroic rescue, no triumph over overwhelming odds. There is only a general store in Louisiana, a careful merchant extending credit and managing inventory, a man who died comfortably in bed rather than freezing in a blizzard or starving during a drought. So Perley simply does not appear. When Laura writes Farmer Boy about Almanzo's childhood in New York, she mentions his siblings, Royal, Eliza Jane, Alice, but Perley, born after the family moved to Minnesota, has no place in that New York narrative. When she writes about Almanzo's life in De Smet, Perley is in Louisiana building his store absent from the story. The omission becomes complete, total, permanent. By 1937, 3 years after Perley's death, Laura has published 5 books. They are taught in schools, reviewed in national newspapers, embraced as authentic accounts of frontier experience. Almanzo appears throughout these books as a central character, the brave homesteader, the man who risked his life driving wheat through a blizzard, the husband who persevered through agricultural disaster. But of his youngest brother, the one who succeeded where Almanzo struggled, who built wealth where Almanzo found only hardship, who died prosperous while Almanzo lived on his daughter's charity, there is not a single mention. The historical record begins to reflect this literary erasure. When people research the Wilder family, they consult Laura's books as primary sources. Those books mention Royal and Eliza Jane and Alice, so those siblings are remembered, researched, incorporated into the expanding scholarship about Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family. Perley, unmentioned in the books, becomes unfindable except to genealogists willing to search through Louisiana parish records, census data, and courthouse documents. And who would think to search for him? If Laura Ingalls Wilder did not consider Almanzo's youngest brother worth mentioning, why would historians? This is how erasure happens, not through active suppression, but through selective inclusion. The stories that get told define what people remember. The stories that go untold vanish as completely as if they never occurred. Perley Day. Wilder built a successful business, raised 6 children, contributed to his community's development, and accumulated substantial wealth through 40 years of commercial operation. These accomplishments are real, documented, verifiable through multiple sources. But they are invisible to the millions who read Laura's books, who watch the later television adaptation, who visit the Laura Ingalls Wilder historic sites scattered across the Midwest. Those people know about Almanzo's wheat run. They know about the long winter and the grasshopper plague, and the struggles of De Smet's early settlers. They know nothing about a general store in Kinder, Louisiana, or the man who ran it for 4 decades. History, it turns out, is not determined by what happened. It is determined by what gets recorded, what gets published, what gets read, and what gets remembered. Perley's story happened, but it did not get told. And what is not told does not exist in collective memory, no matter how substantial the reality was. The complete erasure of Perley Day Wilder's actual life takes its final ironic form in 1974, 40 years after his death, when NBC launches a television series based on Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. Little House on the Prairie will run for 9 seasons, reach millions of viewers, and embed itself so deeply in American popular culture that, for many people, the TV show becomes more real than the historical events it loosely depicts. And in this television universe, Perley Day Wilder finally appears, as a character who bears almost no resemblance to the real man. The TV Perley, portrayed as Almanzo's younger brother, appears in several episodes as comic relief, irresponsible, immature, a source of trouble who requires Almanzo to bail him out of various predicaments. He is written as a foil to Almanzo's steady reliability, a character whose function is to make the hero look better by comparison. This fictional Perley is everything the real Perley was not. The real Perley was cautious, calculating, successful. The TV Perley is reckless and foolish. The real Perley built a commercial empire through patient accumulation. The TV Perley cannot hold a job. The real Perley supported his family through the Great Depression. The TV Perley needs constant rescue from his own poor decisions. The irony is devastating. For 40 years, Perley Day Wilder was completely absent from public memory, neither mentioned in Laura's books nor acknowledged in historical accounts of the Wilder family. Then, when he finally appears in popular culture, he is transformed into a caricature, a joke, a character whose purpose is to demonstrate what frontier men should not be. The television writers who created this fictional Perley had no access to the historical record. They were not trying to portray the real man. They did not know the real man existed. They were simply creating a character to serve narrative functions in a family drama. They needed someone irresponsible to create conflict. They made it Almanzo's younger brother. They gave him the name Perley because genealogical records showed that Almanzo had a brother named Perley, but they never researched who that brother actually was, what he actually accomplished, or how different his real trajectory was from Almanzo's. Why would they? They were making television entertainment, not documentary history. The result is a double erasure. First, Perley's real story was omitted from Laura's books, rendering him invisible to generations of readers. Then his name was appropriated for a fictional character who embodies the opposite of what the real Perley represented. If Perley Day Wilder could witness this transformation, the man who spent 6 decades building commercial success through careful planning would surely find bitter humour in his fictional portrayal as a hapless fool. The merchant who extended credit based on meticulous assessment of character and repayment probability is rewritten as someone who cannot manage his own affairs. The businessman who survived multiple economic depressions through conservative financial management becomes a punchline about frontier irresponsibility. This is what happens when mythology replaces history. The television show needs heroes and fools, dramatic conflicts and tidy resolutions. The real Perley's story, successful but undramatic, profitable but unromantic, cannot fit into this narrative structure. So a fictional Perley is invented to serve the story's needs. Millions of Americans watch these episodes, grasping the image of Perley as troublemaker and fool. They have no reason to question this portrayal. The show is based on Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, which are understood as historical accounts, so naturally the characters must be historically accurate. Except they are not. Perley never lived in De Smet. He never appeared in Laura's life during the period she wrote it about. The TV show's Perley is pure invention, a character who shares nothing with the historical Perley Day Wilder, except a name and a familial relationship to Almanzo. But who knows this? Who would think to research the real Perley Day Wilder to verify whether the TV portrayal is accurate? The show is popular entertainment, not scholarly documentary. Viewers accept the portrayal because they have no reason to question it. This is how historical erasure becomes complete. First, omit someone from the written record. Then, when their name surfaces, attach it to a fictional character who contradicts everything they actually were. The real person disappears beneath layers of mythology so thick that excavating the truth requires sustained research effort that almost no one will ever undertake. Somewhere in Kinder, Louisiana, descendants of Perley Day Wilder watch these television episodes with bewilderment. They know the family stories. They know about the general store, the post office, the rental properties, the successful commercial operation that sustained the family through the Depression. They know that Perley was nothing like the bumbling fool portrayed on national television. But what can they do? Write letters to NBC explaining that their ancestor was actually a successful merchant? Demand corrections to a fictional television show? The effort seems futile. The show is popular, the portrayal is established, and the truth is too complicated to fit into a letter to the editor. So they watch in silence as their ancestor's name is attached to a character who represents the opposite of everything he accomplished. They watch as millions of Americans absorb this fictional portrayal as truth. They watch as the final traces of Perley Day Wilder's real story vanish beneath the weight of television mythology. And they understand, perhaps better than anyone, how completely history can be rewritten when storytelling replaces scholarship, when entertainment supersedes accuracy, when mythology becomes more powerful than truth. The divergence between Almanzo and Perley's life trajectories reveals something fundamental about frontier America that the mythology obscures. There were multiple paths to success, as the most celebrated path was often the least successful. Almanzo Wilder, the homesteader, The brave pioneer, the hero of Laura's books and the television series, struggled financially his entire life. After the disasters in Dakota Territory, the failed crops, the diphtheria, the house fire, he and Laura drifted from place to place, always farming, never quite achieving security. They ended up in Mansfield, Missouri, on a farm they called Rocky Ridge, working the land into their 70s. Their survival in old age depended on their daughter Rose, who became a successful writer and sent money to support her aging parents. Without Rose's financial assistance, Almanzo and Laura would have faced genuine poverty in their final years. The romantic frontier dream that drew them to Dakota Territory in 1879 never delivered the prosperity it promised. Almanzo died in 1949 at age 92, having lived a long life but not a prosperous one. His legacy is literary rather than financial. He is remembered because Laura wrote about him, not because he achieved the economic success that frontier mythology promised to brave homesteaders. Perley Day Wilder, the merchant, the cautious calculator, the man who chose commerce over homesteading, built substantial wealth that supported his family through the Depression and provided inheritance for his children. He died at 64, having spent 40 years building a commercial operation that generated reliable profit through multiple economic cycles. His children inherited property, business equity, and financial literacy. They entered adulthood with advantages their father purchased through decades of careful accumulation. The Wilder name carried weight in Kinder, Louisiana, representing commercial reliability and community standing. But Perley has no literary legacy. Laura did not write about him. The television show transformed him into a joke. His actual accomplishments, the store, the post office, the rental properties, the successful navigation of frontier economics, are buried in Louisiana parish records that almost no one will ever consult. This comparison reveals the fundamental disconnect between frontier mythology and frontier reality. American culture celebrates the Almanzo path, the brave homesteader risking everything on agricultural independence, while ignoring the Perley path, the merchant who arrived with capital, built commercial infrastructure, and accumulated wealth through patient operation. Yet economically, the Perley path was far more successful. Merchants prospered in frontier communities at rates that homesteaders could never match. The businesses that supplied goods, extended credit, and controlled distribution networks extracted wealth from agricultural production without bearing the risks of weather, pests, and price fluctuations. The successful frontier was not built by brave homesteaders struggling against the elements. It was built by merchants like Perley, by bankers who financed operations, by railroad executives who controlled transportation, by grain elevator operators who determined prices, by the entire commercial infrastructure that connected rural producers to national and international markets. But this reality contradicts the mythology Americans prefer. The mythology requires brave individuals conquering wilderness through self-reliance and hard work. It cannot accommodate the truth that success usually came through capital, connections, and control of commercial bottlenecks. So Almanzo becomes the celebrated hero despite his economic struggles, while Perley becomes invisible despite his commercial success. The mythology requires heroes, not accountants. It needs dramatic survival stories, not inventory management. It celebrates agricultural independence even when that independence led to poverty. The real history of the American frontier is not about brave homesteaders like Almanzo. Or rather, it is not only about them. It is equally about merchants like Perley, about the commercial operators who built the economic systems that made frontier settlement sustainable, who transformed isolated agricultural communities into integrated market economies. But that history remains untold. When Americans think about the frontier, they imagine covered wagons and log cabins, not general stores and credit ledgers. They remember the long winter and the wheat run, not the quarterly inventory accounting and the careful assessment of borrowers' creditworthiness. They know Almanzo Wilder's name because Laura wrote books about him. They do not know Perley Day Wilder's name because he was omitted from those books, then caricatured in the television adaptation, then forgotten entirely except by descendants and genealogists. This is what erasure looks like. Not dramatic suppression or deliberate conspiracy, but simple omission compounded over decades until the absence becomes permanent. Perley's story was not stolen. It simply was not told, and what is not told does not exist in public memory, regardless of how significant it was in actual lived experience. The final irony is that both brothers were successful by different measures. Almanzo succeeded in embodying frontier virtues: hard work, perseverance, agricultural independence, even though those virtues did not translate to prosperity. Perley succeeded in building actual wealth, raising a family in security, and establishing multi-generational economic advantage. But only one brother is remembered, and it is not the one who succeeded economically. Because American frontier mythology values symbolic success over material prosperity, narrative drama over commercial stability, romantic suffering over calculated profit. Almanzo gets the books and the television series. Perley gets a modest gravestone in a Louisiana cemetery that almost no one visits. History is not written by the victors. It is written by those whose stories fit the narratives that cultures need to tell themselves about their past. And sometimes, the most successful lives are the ones that disappear most completely. The story of Perley Day Wilder exists in fragments scattered across Louisiana archives, census records, and courthouse documents. Unlike his famous sister-in-law, whose life was meticulously documented through her own books and countless biographies, Perley's existence must be reconstructed from bureaucratic paper trails, the kind of evidence that records facts but reveals little about the man himself. The 1900 census lists him as a merchant in Kinder, Louisiana, living with his wife Elsie and their growing family. The 1910 census shows the same. The 1920 census reveals increased property holdings. The 1930 census, taken just 4 years before his death, documents a successful businessman in his 60s, still operating the store that has defined his adult life. Parish tax records tell another story, the steady accumulation of property. A commercial building purchased in 1902, residential lots acquired in 1908, farmland obtained during the post-war recession of 1919, when desperate farmers sold at distressed prices. Each acquisition represents calculated investment, capital deployed at opportune moments, wealth compounding year after year. The post office records maintained by the federal government document Perley's appointment as postmaster and his decades of service in that capacity. This was no ceremonial position. The postmaster managed mail distribution, sold stamps and money orders, processed registered letters, and served as the federal government's representative in the community. The salary was modest but reliable, continuing even through the Depression when private commerce faltered. Church records from the Kinder Methodist Church show the Wilder family's participation in religious life, baptisms of children, donations to building funds, membership in good standing. These entries reveal social integration, the transformation from Yankee outsider to accepted community member, the kind of respectability that successful merchants cultivated as carefully as they managed inventory. Business records, though fragmentary, provide glimpses of commercial operations. A receipt from 1912 shows Wilder's general store purchasing 200 pounds of rice seed from a Crowley supplier. An advertisement from 1923 lists the store's inventory, dry goods, groceries, hardware, farm implements, and postal services. A credit agreement from 1928, yellowed and barely legible, documents a loan to a rice farmer secured by a lien on the fall harvest. These documents, individually mundane, collectively paint a portrait of sustained commercial success. Perley was not wealthy by urban standards. He would never appear on lists of America's richest men. But in the context of rural Louisiana, in a town of fewer than 1,000 residents, he was substantial. He owned property, employed workers, controlled credit, and occupied a position of economic centrality that few achieved. Yet none of these records appear in popular histories of the American frontier. When scholars research Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family, they consult her books, letters, and the extensive archives maintained at libraries and museums dedicated to preserving her legacy. They find detailed information about Almanzo's childhood in New York, his homesteading in Dakota, his marriage and struggles, and eventual retirement in Missouri. But they find nothing about Perley unless they specifically search Louisiana parish records, and why would they? Laura never mentioned him. No biographer has considered him significant enough to research. He exists in a documentary void, visible only to genealogists tracing Wilder family lineages and local historians documenting Kinder's commercial development. This archival invisibility raises questions about how frontier history gets written. The sources that survive and get preserved determine what stories can be told. Laura's books ensured that her papers, letters, and memorabilia would be carefully archived and made available to researchers. Museums preserve the houses she lived in, the objects she owned, the manuscripts she wrote. Perley has no museum, no archived papers, no preserved homestead. His store building, if it still stands, likely bears no historical marker. The house he built for his family has probably been demolished or renovated beyond recognition. The physical traces of his 40-year presence in Kinder have vanished, replaced by newer construction, modern commerce, the relentless forward march of development that erases the past. What remains are those bureaucratic records, census entries, tax assessments, business licenses, death certificates, the skeleton of a life, facts without flesh, dates without stories. We know Perley existed, where he lived, what he did for a living, when he died. We know he married Elsie, fathered 6 children, operated a successful store, accumulated property, served as postmaster, but we do not know what he thought about his choices. We do not know if he felt satisfaction watching his brother struggle while he prospered, or guilt, or indifference. We do not know if he questioned his decision to go south instead of west, to choose commerce over homesteading, to build wealth rather than pursue the romantic frontier dream. We do not know if he ever regretted the path not taken, or if he ever wondered whether Americans would remember the brave homesteaders who failed more than the cautious merchants who succeeded. The records cannot tell us these things. They preserve facts, not feelings. They document transactions, not thoughts. They prove existence, but not experience. And so Perley Day Wilder remains a ghost in the archives. Real but insubstantial, documented but unknown, successful but forgotten. The question is, why does his erasure matter? What difference does it make that millions know Almanzo's story, while almost no one knows Perley's? The answer reveals something fundamental about how America remembers its past. The erasure of Perley Day Wilder from American frontier history is not simply an interesting genealogical footnote. It represents a systematic distortion of how the frontier actually worked, who actually succeeded, and what actually built the American West. The mythology, as embodied in Laura Ingalls Wilder's books and their countless adaptations, celebrates a particular type of frontier experience. The brave homesteader claiming free land, working that land through sheer determination, achieving independence through agricultural self-sufficiency. This narrative is deeply embedded in American culture, taught in schools, reinforced in popular media, treated as fundamental truth about the nation's westward expansion. But the mythology obscures as much as it reveals. For every homesteader who succeeded, and many did eventually, there were others who failed, who abandoned claims after years of struggle, who returned east broken in health and finances. Almanzo Wilder himself represents this reality. He homesteaded in Dakota, faced catastrophic setbacks, and never achieved the prosperity that the Homestead Act seemed to promise. Yet Almanzo is celebrated as a frontier hero because his story fits the mythology. He embodied the values Americans want to believe defined frontier settlement: courage, perseverance, agricultural virtue, self-reliance. That these virtues did not translate to material success is treated as irrelevant, or even as evidence of the value's purity. He remained poor because he refused to compromise his principles, to abandon farming for easier commercial pursuits. Perley represents the opposite trajectory, and this is precisely why his story has been erased. He did not homestead. He did not claim free land or break virgin prairie. He arrived in Louisiana with capital, purchased property rather than claiming it, built wealth through commerce rather than agriculture. His success came from extending credit at profitable rates, from acquiring property when prices were low, from controlling distribution networks that extracted value from agricultural production without bearing agricultural risks. This is not the story Americans want to hear about their frontier. It suggests that success came not through democratic opportunity available to all, but through capital accumulation available to few. It reveals that the romantic vision of independent farmers was undercut by economic structures that funneled wealth to merchants, bankers, and commercial operators. It demonstrates that the frontier was not primarily an escape from capitalism, but an expansion of capitalist relations into new territories. Acknowledging Perley's story would require acknowledging that the frontier was built as much by economic calculation as by pioneer courage, that wealth came as often through commercial control as through agricultural labor, that the infrastructure supporting homesteaders, the stores, the credit systems, the grain elevators, the railroads, was operated by men whose motivations were profit rather than settlement. This is why Perley remains invisible. Not because his life was unimportant or his success insignificant, but because recognizing his importance would complicate the mythology in uncomfortable ways. But history should be uncomfortable. It should challenge our assumptions, force us to question the stories we tell ourselves, reveal complexities that simple narratives obscure. The frontier was not simply a place where brave individuals conquered wilderness. It was an economic system, a political project, a vast transformation involving millions of people pursuing diverse strategies with wildly varying outcomes. Some of those people were homesteaders like Almanzo, struggling to make free land productive. Others were merchants like Perley, building commercial operations that profited from homesteaders' needs. Some were railroad executives, bankers, land speculators, mining companies, timber corporations, all extracting wealth from frontier resources and frontier labor. The complete history of the American frontier must include all these actors, not just the ones who fit comfortably into mythological frameworks. It must acknowledge that success came through multiple paths, that those paths had different ethical implications and different economic outcomes, that romanticizing one path while ignoring others distorts our understanding of what actually happened. Perley Day Wilder's life matters because it represents the millions of frontier participants whose stories have been erased to preserve a simpler, more comforting mythology. The merchants who supplied goods, the bankers who controlled credit, the landlords who accumulated property during economic downturns, these people shaped frontier development as much as homesteaders did, perhaps more so. But we do not build museums to merchants. We do not teach children about successful credit operations or strategic property acquisition during depressions. We teach them about little houses on prairies, about brave families conquering wilderness, about the triumph of American values over natural adversity. And in doing so, we ensure that future generations will never understand how the frontier actually worked, who actually prospered, or what that prosperity cost. Perley's erasure is not accidental. It is systematic, deliberate in its effects, if not its intentions, designed to preserve a mythology that cannot withstand historical scrutiny. The question is not whether Perley Day Wilder deserves to be remembered. The documentary evidence of his substantial success answers that shit clearly. The question is whether Americans are willing to remember a frontier that contradicts the comforting stories they have been told. Because once you acknowledge that men like Perley built the frontier as much as men like Almanzo, you must also acknowledge that the frontier was not primarily about democratic opportunity or pioneer virtue. It was about who had capital, who controlled commerce, and who extracted wealth from other people's labor. And that is a very different story than the one Laura Ingalls Wilder chose to tell. In the end, the comparison between Almanzo and Perley, Wilder reveals something profound about the American frontier and the mythology that obscures its reality. Almanzo Wilder died on October 23rd, 1949, at the age of 92. He spent his final years on the Rocky Ridge farm in Mansfield, Missouri, supported financially by his daughter Rose. His last decades were marked by the literary success of his wife's books, which made him famous but not wealthy. The book's profits went primarily to Laura and later to Rose, not to Almanzo himself. He lived long enough to see Laura's books become bestsellers, to witness his own transformation into a literary character, to experience the strange disconnection between his actual life of struggle and the heroic narrative Laura constructed. Whether he found this satisfying or bitter, the historical record does not reveal. He was not a reflective man, not one to leave detailed accounts of his inner thoughts. What is documented is his poverty. Despite decades of hard work, despite embodying every virtue the frontier mythology celebrates, Almanzo never achieved financial security. He farmed until his body could no longer sustain the labor. He depended on others for support in old age. He died without substantial assets to leave his descendants. Perley Day Wilder died 15 years earlier, on May 10, 1934, at age 64. He spent his final years in the Louisiana home he purchased with decades of commercial profits, surrounded by the family he supported through the Great Depression, secure in the knowledge that his children would inherit property and capital. He died prosperous but unknown. No books celebrated his achievements, no mythology formed around his commercial success. He was buried in a small Louisiana cemetery, mourned by a community that knew him as a reliable merchant and respected citizen, then gradually forgotten as that generation passed away. 15 years later, when Almanzo died, obituaries appeared in newspapers across the country. He was the husband of Laura Ingalls Wilder, The Almanzo from the Little House books, a man whose fame derived entirely from his wife's literary success. The obituaries mentioned his homesteading, his farming, his embodiment of frontier values. They did not mention his brother Perley. Why would they? Perley had been dead for 15 years, and even when alive he existed outside the narrative that made Almanzo famous. The final accounting is stark. Almanzo is remembered by millions but died in relative poverty. Perley died prosperous but is remembered by almost no one. Fame and fortune in their cases proved entirely disconnected. But which brother truly succeeded? The answer depends on how you define success. If success means embodying frontier virtues, maintaining agricultural independence, living according to principles regardless of economic outcome, then Almanzo succeeded magnificently. He never compromised, never abandoned farming for easier commercial pursuits, never betrayed the homesteader ideal, even when that ideal failed to provide prosperity. If success means providing for your family, accumulating wealth, building economic security that survives across generations, then Perley succeeded completely. He identified opportunity, executed a business plan, adapted to economic conditions, and built substantial assets through 40 years of careful operation. American mythology celebrates Almanzo's type of success while barely acknowledging that Perley's type exists. We build museums to pioneers who struggled, not merchants who prospered. We teach children about homesteaders who persevered through hardship, not about commercial operators who profited from that hardship. But the merchants were there. They were always there, supplying the goods that homesteaders purchased, extending the credit that financed agricultural operations, acquiring the property that desperate farmers sold during economic downturns. They were essential to frontier development, perhaps more essential than the homesteaders themselves. The frontier could not have functioned without commercial infrastructure. Someone had to supply goods, facilitate credit, connect rural producers to distant markets. Men like Perley built that infrastructure, profited from building it, and enabled the settlement that mythology celebrates. Yet they remain invisible in the stories America tells about itself. This invisibility is not accidental. It serves a purpose. Acknowledging the Perleys of frontier history would require acknowledging that the frontier was built through economic systems that concentrated wealth, that capital mattered more than courage, that success came more reliably through commerce than agriculture. And that acknowledgement would shatter the mythology that Americans need to believe about their past. So Almanzo remains famous and Perley remains forgotten. The brother who struggled becomes a hero. The brother who prospered becomes invisible. And the complete history of how the American frontier actually worked remains buried beneath layers of selective memory and deliberate erasure. But here is what the mythology cannot erase. Somewhere in Louisiana, descendants of Perley Day Wilder inherit property he accumulated, benefit from wealth he built, live lives made more secure by his 40 years of careful commercial operation. And somewhere in the archives the records remain, census entries, tax assessments, business documents, proving that he existed, that he succeeded, that he built something substantial even if no one chose to celebrate it. The question now becomes, what happened to the famous brother, the celebrated hero whose struggles we all know? What were those 4 disasters that nearly destroyed Almanzo and Laura's marriage between 1885 and 1889? The catastrophes that Laura's books mentioned but never fully revealed? That story is darker than the mythology suggests. And it begins with a wedding that should have been a beginning, but marked the start of 4 years of suffering that would break most couples completely. But that is a story for next time.